Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast hosted by me, Dr. Stefan Walzer. I am the innovator of Market Access 4.0 and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics since 2004. Discover Market Access 4.0 and unveil the future with our innovative solutions. Max Insights, our fast and easy AI-based reimbursement planning platform. Dobo, our new revolutionizing way of creating reimbursement dossiers across the globe with the first and only dossier writing AI bot. Cubo, our new AI-based objection handling platform. And Waffle, train with Waffle's virtual reality genius in an immersive environment and with an AI-based counterpart. We are Market Access 4.0. So check out our website, marketaccess4-0.com. And now let's dive into the current discussions, processes, and trends in market access across the globe. Welcome to another show of the Market Access podcast. Today I have Sreeram Ramagopalan as a guest. Ram is a highly accomplished expert at the intersection of biotech value creation, market access, health technology assessment, and real-world evidence. I think, Ram, you're widely recognized for your thought leadership on how evidence pricing, reimbursement, and policy shape commercial success in life sciences. I think you have also published extensively journals, I think also books and a lot of other kind of things. And I think one of your latest paper we maybe as well take as a maybe kind of side story or the core of our discussion today, which is around the UK HTA reform and US pricing reform. But before jumping into the details, of course, welcome to the show, Ram.
Thanks, Stefan. Pleasure to be here today. I'm very excited to contribute to your podcast series.
Very good. Perfect. No, I mean, I think your latest paper, whoever has not read it, we'll as well link it in the show notes. I think it's a really interesting one. But before we maybe dig into those kind of details, do you want maybe to quickly introduce as well the very top level, the UK and also the US kind of pricing / system environment that everybody who has, or maybe who's not an expert in this area, can also follow then thereafter the discussion where we dig a bit deeper into the latest changes?
Sure, happy to do so, Stefan. So I think in the UK, or particularly in England, we have a national HTA body called NICE, or the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. And that body, on behalf of the government, negotiates or assesses the value of medicines in a cost-effectiveness framework and effectively sets the price for what those medicines come to market at. Now, NICE was set up in 1999, and there's been a lot of issues or concern that they haven't changed their cost-effectiveness threshold for 25 years. So that threshold, what they're willing to pay for a drug is £20,000 to £30,000 per quality-adjusted life year that a medicine provides. And so there's been a lot of concern that threshold has not changed. And we'll talk about that later in the podcast, but that threshold has now been increased due to some of the kind of geopolitical activities, especially coming from the US. Within the US, that's historically a free market environment. So there's up until very recently, there's been no government negotiating prices. So the government allows effectively the market to set the prices medicines can come to. Now, there's different payers within the US environment. So we've got Medicare, which is the government system, and that covers people from the age of 65. We've got Medicaid, so people have certain kind of socioeconomic criteria can get Medicaid access, and again, that's a government program. And then there's commercial health insurance plans that cover the rest of the population.
Perfect. Yeah, I think this is, just important to get already the latest discussions up there. I think you mentioned already, some of the discussion. I know that as well when I was in industry on the cost effectiveness threshold and the level of that in the UK. I think long debate, you said that already. So what was the key reason that something has changed in the UK? And especially, let's see, if you could as well allude a bit, what finally has changed? And maybe as well the question, we're recording that end of April. Is it already in effect or is it still under political debate?
Yeah, so I think coming from President Trump's executive order from March last year, so this is the most favored nation executive order by President Trump, and and I think this has even started earlier, sort of taking a step back. From 2022, President Biden put in the Inflation Reduction Act, and that allowed Medicare for the first time to negotiate drug prices on behalf of the government. So I think we're seeing increasing price scrutiny from the US, because US drug prices tend to be a magnitude higher than what is achievable elsewhere, especially in Europe. And so President Trump also wanted to kind of push that further and saying that that price difference is unacceptable. And so the US should only pay prices as high as in comparable markets in Europe. Now, that pressure, I guess that political pressure that was put in place by President Trump, and also I think over the last 10 years, we're seeing increasing numbers of medicines not being launched in the UK, and manufacturers pulling out their R&D investments from the UK. And so the UK government has a life science strategy, so they want to attract investment. And I guess one of the pressures that they were getting, both from the US as well as from manufacturers themselves, that the UK wasn't paying enough for medicines. And so they have now, I guess, they put in a provisional guidance saying that they were going to increase that threshold that NICE could pay for drugs. So from 20 to 30,000 to 25 to 35,000. And that now has gone through kind of the various parliament processes, and now it's kind of a legally binding implementation. So that is in place now. So the new threshold for NICE is 25 to 35,000 pounds, and the hope is that that's going to increase. I guess the UK government hope is that that's going to increase investment from manufacturers, so R&D investment, and also enable greater patient access to medicine. So where the medicines were being launched in the UK, it's hoping that this new threshold will allow more medicines to be launched in the UK.
Perfect. Yeah. I mean, it's still the question what is it, between 12.5 and maybe a bit more than 20% increase, if that is enough, right? But let it be, right? I think the discussion was there, and I think we should also maybe appreciate as well if such political changes also happen over time. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, I think you also explained, I think the political environment probably had to change, especially as there was that kind of external effect from the US through the MFN, right?
Yeah, exactly. I don't think it would have happened without President Trump in office and really kind of forcing these things to happen. I think that's something that's to think about, just how quickly these changes have happened. I mean, we've been in market access for many years now, both of us, and I think there's never been a more interesting time in market access, just because the changes are happening very quickly and they're implemented very quickly. And so moving from President Trump's executive order to now, and we'll talk about this later, but MFN models already in place in reference countries that are kind of influencing the US price, and then the UK now changing its cost-effective threshold. That's all happened in the space of a year. So it's actually an incredible pace of progress. And to your point, whether or not that kind of relatively small increase is enough to attract more companies to launch in the UK is another matter, and that's something that we have to see what happens in the next few years.
Absolutely, no, fully agree. But maybe just go back, I think, to the two kind of reforms in a way. If you take MFN maybe for the US, and then of course as well the increase in terms of the cost-effectiveness threshold. Maybe going a bit back as well to our, let's say, strategic view, especially let's say from a pharma/biotech perspective. From your perspective, what is the single biggest strategic message pharma leaders are still underestimating, especially around those two key changes happening in the market?
I think just historically, we were always used to the US being the free pricing environment. So you could do whatever you want in the US, launch at a high price, and that's where you get most of your revenues. And then you try and get some revenues outside of the US and doing whatever you can in terms of providing evidence and meeting HTA requirements. And I think we're still not realizing, or many in the field aren't realizing actually that's no longer the case. So where companies have, a US operation and ex-US, international European operations, and they tend to be siloed. So US is, you maximize price, maximize revenue, and Europe, it's maximize revenue wherever possible. So that's kind of accepting prices in various markets, but trying to, maximize some revenue. That no longer can be the case. So whatever's happening in Europe is going to impact your US price. And so really we need to be thinking about what is that global strategy, what is that price floor that's going to optimize revenues, and where can and can't you launch as a company. So really just thinking holistically on a global level, where can we launch and at what price, and what's going to be that optimized revenue generation.
Yeah, I think this is, a very important point. And I think I'm just, when I first thought about MFN, those quite a few months now ago, I was also thinking to the same direction, right? Suddenly the global functions in our area and market access are getting global, because a lot of companies basically had that split between, let's say, US and let's say ex-US, maybe call it like that, right? Now, maybe it's really getting into a fully globally initiated kind of strategy at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think obviously there's some companies, the top 20 pharma, whatever, they've got deals with the White House and moving US manufacturing, and it may not apply so much to them. I mean, it remains to be seen what happens, but it's really that small to mid-sized pharma that really kind of separate out US, ex-US, and they're going to be affected by this tremendously. And I don't think they're preparing well enough in terms of that global strategy.
Yeah, fully agree. Just coming back again to the increase of the cost of factor threshold. I mean, firstly, I think generally, and that's also what I read in different papers, LinkedIn announcements, posts, and the like, I think it generally sounds like good news for access also in the UK, right? I mean, the level we just discussed it, needs to be seen. But I think there might also be a kind of paradox, right? I mean, I think that's also what you mentioned in your paper. So maybe can you allude a bit as well further how maybe a more permissive UK environment still creates potentially pressure on global pricing, especially in the US?
Yeah, so I guess just taking a step back, most medicines, their revenues or net present value, 70% of that comes from the US pricing and US access in general. And anything else is kind of a nice to have, but most companies don't tend to optimize for that. We now, and potentially if that's, if you're not able to meet the cost effectiveness threshold in the UK, which was, 20 to 30, companies just wouldn't launch because it wasn't going to be meaningful in terms of revenue generation. Now with this new threshold, it does on the outside seem exciting. Maybe more drugs will be launched in the UK. But even with that higher threshold, that price achievable in the UK may not be sufficient to match the price that's achievable in the US. And now with the various MFN models, so, depending on Medicare Part B, Part D, there's different models, but the UK is a reference market for all of the MFN models. And so if you have launched in the US at a certain price, and then in the UK, the price achievable is higher than it historically was, that may still impact the US price. And then overall, even though you're able to potentially get a higher, or there's an increased revenue generation from the UK, that may still cause an overall drop in global revenue generation because you have to drop the US price to match the UK. And so strategically, unless you're not thinking this through and modeling it out, you may lose revenue at a global perspective just because of the drop in US price or global prices, or companies may be strategic if they thought about it and just actually this threshold is not enough to match what's happening in the US, and so we will just not launch in the UK, so it's not going to jeopardize our US price.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the important thing is what I read as well from what you just said as well in the last couple of minutes. I think strategic thinking, strategic planning is getting even more important than it was in the past, right? And not only, as you said, maybe for 1, 2, 3 countries, but probably across. And I mean, if you fully agree that it was also my kind of, let's say, experience, 70-80% of the revenue is being planned from the US, at least until now. And the other part was rather, let's just go there. But it was not, a lot of time was not so optimized or not so strategically taken, which I think is now changing as well, right?
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I think manufacturers are in a shock if they're not strategic planning, but I think they definitely need to. And then there's a lot of trade-offs. So obviously reference pricing has existed for a while, and there's been, sequencing of what markets do you go for in Europe and some Asian countries which are referencing those prices. But now the major market is referencing kind of key countries. And so you have to think about what is that impact on overall revenues if you're launching in specific countries that are referenced by the US.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, interesting. I mean, my kind of thought, and I mean, that's maybe as well more informed from papers out of international reference pricing, right? Where generally, I think what has been seen in a lot of countries then that prices were rather not lowered, but generally all of the level gross price, of course, have just been list prices have just been increased in general. I mean, if I take just what you said as well. Look, I mean, if you would just say 70% US prices, still a bit of more uncertainty, further uncertainty, let's say across Europe, maybe take Asia as a kind of step beyond, would it not be more safe for companies simply increasing overall my launch prices, at least in general, right? In order then to optimize, especially maybe taking the uncertainties, as you just said, if you want to maybe get as well into Europe, UK, maybe some other markets there, where maybe prices could hit as well US price later on, just in terms of the percentage discounts. Would that make maybe the kind of future potentially? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the strategies where you already know that you're not going to get a net price that's anywhere close to the US. And so I think one of the strategies is that can you have these confidential discounts in place where really the net price is not available, and it's no one, I guess, in the US can see it. I think there's a question on whether the US, with legal powers and so on, would force manufacturers to reveal those prices. So that's an unknown at this stage. But I think that confidential discounting, so you can have those list prices that are similar to the US, that is a potential strategy that people are talking about. That may be a way to kind of achieve access globally, even though the pricing may be different.
Yeah, no, agree. I mean, you also mentioned, I think, especially in your intro words, the Inflation Reduction Act, right? And the kind of link to at that point in time, the first negotiations, which could and have already happened in the meantime between the manufacturers and as well the let's say government-led kind of institutions. Would you see that as a separate policy tool, or would you rather say, given MFN, this is maybe a bit more even interlinked, and we have not even touched base on tariffs, right? So is that rather geopolitical kind of overall picture, or is it really different tools, and the companies would need to think, let's say, stepwise on those different tools?
So I think they are different tools, but I think it just speaks to the climate we're in, where drug pricing is just being increasingly scrutinized. So I think it's not just in the US. Obviously, in Europe, we've got EUJCA, other countries, kind of tweaking their HTA processes to provide more scrutiny on value. And then there's kind of, clawbacks on revenue made and so on. So I think there's just this global attitude or feeling that drug price is too high and needs to be more and more controlled. And historically, the US was this outlier that, the free market was going to control prices. But that even there, I think we're just now seeing IRA started it. Now we've got MFN. Who knows where it will go? But the direction of travel is just increasing scrutiny. And so whereas IRA is kind of a domestic price negotiation, somewhat their own HTA at, I guess, the period of or close to patent expiry, or effectively making patent expiry earlier, different for small molecules versus biologics. MFN now is setting the initial prices to be references. So I think we've got patent expiry coming a bit earlier, effectively through IRA, and then MFN setting that initial price that, on the whole, the overall period for revenue generation or maximizing revenue generation is getting smaller for companies. And so they really do need to be strategic in terms of how do they get that optimal return on investment? How do they get that optimal NPV to make it attractive for investment in drug development?
Of course. And I mean, we have just discussed now about pricing itself, but of course, pricing is also informed, and of course, about cost effectiveness. But I mean, both are being informed, especially, let's say, by the evidence base, right? I mean, given the geopolitical discussion we also just had, are we now all maybe even moving into areas where also the market access function need to broaden themselves? Let's say not only getting to design, for example, evidence pricing, but now also, for example, geography strategy, hence putting everything rather into an integrated system. Is that as well the move we all see now with all of the changes happening?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the smartest manufacturers will have it all integrated. So I think in the companies I've worked at, market access would have a somewhat of a say in phase 2 discussions and pivotal trial. Whether or not it was listened to is another matter. But there's always that trade-off, get to the US first, and that historically has required lower evidence, and then you try and deal with ex-US based on that data and try and get access if you can. But that now is jeopardizing the overall pricing strategy. So if you've designed, a single-arm trial or non-hard endpoints in the trial or the wrong comparator, that's going to massively affect the price you get or potential price you could get in Europe. And it's obviously starting earlier now with JCA. But so it's really how do we integrate that pricing, that geography strategy, as you say, with kind of the evidence requirements and making sure you're planning to get the optimal price in all markets. You may not launch in Europe, but you should be designing the trials to get kind of a high price or achieve premium pricing in Europe. And then if you don't do that, you're removing the optionality versus just planning for the options and having the best evidence package is ultimately going to serve you better on a global access situation versus not.
Yeah, and probably as well in the US, right? I mean, also when you need to negotiate whether this is now on a national level or whether you just do the contracting, I mean, the better base you have, of course, the better kind of cards you can play as well in order to optimize, let's say, your outcomes in terms of negotiation/pricing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think we underestimate the kind of restrictions by payers that put in the US. I think it's actually very similar to Europe, prior authorizations, restrictions, and so on. And so the evidence base is going to help with those negotiations and to get higher quality access in the US. So yeah, very much so.
Okay, perfect. I mean, you also just mentioned, of course, let's say the big pharma companies, the big biotech companies, they might already have probably process anyway in place. It might maybe need some kind of adjustment and so on. But maybe moving a bit towards those mid-sized, small biotech companies as well. And we discussed about, let's say, probably more the system level and the impact in general on the industry, et cetera. But maybe move that a bit further into practicability, right? I mean, what does that overall change or the changes probably across the world now mean for launch sequencing, especially for those companies in practice? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think we're seeing some recent examples. So, MFN's been in place, a year or so, but we're seeing some examples. I think Global Data published a study that in the year prior to MFN, as compared to this year, there's been, I think, 40% lower launches in Europe compared to historically. We're seeing companies pulling out some medicines from Europe, or some companies not even launch, or just saying kind of actively to investors they're not launching in Japan and Europe because they're not unsure what the MFN impact is. So I think right now it's being strategically smart about sequencing. So thinking about what is the asset value? Where's the revenues going to be coming from? How do you optimize that? And working out what is that likely price achievable in the US and then in major markets, and then seeing how much of that difference in the other markets would impact a US price if there's going to be, a reference pricing model, which, I mean, the models are already out there, so they will be impacted. And then thinking about, okay, strategically, it makes sense to launch in these countries because then the US price is not impacted as much, and potentially not launching in other countries, and working out the trade-offs. What is the trade-off with for example, a global launch with a lower price, or specific countries at a higher price, and where does that trade-off favor the company and the asset?
I agree. And I think the important thing is probably as well the timing. I mean, as you said, it will start as early as possible, because ultimately it's not only about, let's say, deciding on the launch theoretically, right? I mean, whenever you open up your clinical trial sites, I mean, also the expectation, of course, rise with all of those sites and investigators, which are a lot of time not only local or national QALYs, but sometimes also, let's say, global QALYs, right? So if you open up sites in the UK, in Germany, in France, I don't know, in Japan, and suddenly just decide, we'll not launch there, you maybe do that once, maybe twice, but then you might also have an issue, not only from your communications perspective, but also maybe running further studies in the future, because they might maybe prioritize other companies and other kind of products and ingredients, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's obviously, reputational damage, reputational risk, as you said. You're getting patients involved in these countries, and you've got no plan to launch in there. So yes, it has to start earlier. And I think normally with these policy changes, it takes 3 years to implement or 5 years, and you've got a bit of time to think about it. But as I said, this pace that we're seeing with MFN, it's already implemented, and so they've really got to be thinking about it now. And it's going to be a huge issue if they're not.
I fully agree. So getting a bit towards the end, and I think you touched base on some of those pieces already, but I mean, if we have, let's say, somebody out of the biotech pharma world, mid-sized, small ones probably rather, listening to the show today, I mean, what would be the kind of top 3 advices, recommendations from your perspective, which should be changed immediately in those kind of, let's say, global pricing and market access planning in light of all of these different developments?
Yeah, I guess the first one is, as we just touched upon, I think it's really planning that launch sequencing and working out the various optionalities for revenue generation. So what is that price achievable in the major markets, and what is that optimized strategy where you're going to get the maximum revenue? And then within that setting, I guess a price floor. So what's the minimum price achievable? So then that's kind of clear guidance to teams that if they're thinking about launching in the UK, is it going to meet that pricing threshold or not? And then secondly, or I guess somewhat thirdly, but just that evidence generation strategy, making sure you're designing pivotal trials that gives the option to launch in Europe and an option to achieve premium pricing. So you're addressing payer needs, payer concerns in Europe. And whether or not you launch or not isn't a different issue, but you have designed the trial with those payers in mind, that if you did want to launch, your price is going to be as best as it can be, and then minimize that impact with a US reference price.
No, that's perfect. Very good. Ram, that was very insightful. I hope that, I'm sure rather that a lot of listeners will get a lot of learnings out of it. And then let's just see if the pace continues and which other kind of changes might as well happen in the next days, weeks, months, and maybe, of course, years.
Indeed. Exciting times for market access people, but pleasure to be on the podcast, Stefan. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
There you go.
Great episode discussion, outlook, but also the current environment together with Ram. I think Ram is, and you have heard that, a big, great global strategic advisor with a lot of experience. And I think the important thing is also really bringing now the different kind of reforms and updates from the various countries into one strategic kind of outlook. I think he has especially now focused, as he is from the UK, on the cost effectiveness threshold and increase there from 20 to 30,000 pounds per QALY up to now 25 to 35,000 pounds per QALY. I think also what he's at, and I agree with that, we need to see if we will see a bigger acceptability by UK NICE and a bigger, let's say, maybe as well acceptability or willingness also to submit in the UK with this increased threshold. Anyhow, of course, and that's the core task by everybody now, doing the math, doing the scenario planning, do the revenue plan, not only the price one, early enough in order then to also see if the submission within Europe, with the example of the UK, but you can also add other countries like France, like Germany, Italy, Spain, but also in Asia, for example, with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, etc., if these really also make sense in case they are, of course, as well then part of the overall MFN package as of now. I mean, these calculations are, of course, having an impact, should be discussed internally, but it's also one component of the overall strategic idea and recommendation in those kind of companies, as it was also before. Price was always a key driver, but should not have been the only one. We have touched base very briefly only on the potential as well impact, for example, on reputation, KOL reputation, but also patient reputation, which should, of course, as well take that part on there. I think in terms of the clear recommendation, we just said launch sequencing, the planning of that with the maximum price and the optimized revenue needs to be done now. And of course, not only now, but as early as possible. And then secondly, also, of course, try to know your price floor, that you can also see if the minimum price, which is acceptable by the company, might also then reach the expectations, which would then also make a positive revenue flow, including. That was an episode of MAP, the market access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.